In this video I will go through the steps I have taken to solve a problem by using VBScript to automate processes and tasks. In this problem we have been supplied with a spreadsheet of user information, which we need to use to create the multiple associated user accounts in Active Directory. All of the supplied information should be added to the user accounts, to the relevant Active Directory user attributes. The first thing to do in this example is to take a look at the supplied data. As can be seen, we have been provided with the first and last name of the user, along with the office and department where they work. Note that in most cases we have also been supplied with their telephone numbers, but a couple of the accounts don't have entries for this, so we will have to accommodate for this in our code. To enable us to read this data into our script, we must first export it into a usable format, in this case a CSV file, also known as a comma-delimited file. Here is the data in its comma-delimited format. The data still has each of the 5 field headings, which we can either ignore that line in our code, or simply remove the line before processing the data. In this case I am going to remove the line, as shown. Also, if you look closely at the data, you will see that there is a space after the first name of Frank Williams. As I will be using the first and last names to create the login name for the user account, I will need to ensure that I remember to remove any spaces. Although it is something that I could manually remove from the data, it is easily missed, so I will write code to accomplish this instead. Once we have looked at the data, we have a good idea of what we want our script to do. Sometimes it is useful to list these requirements, as shown. In our case we need to read in our CSV file, which we can do using the file system object, reading a line at a time. Then we need to separate each of the 5 fields into variables, which we can do using string manipulation techniques. And as part of that, we must ensure that we can handle empty fields in our code, which should not be added to a user account. We need to remove any unwanted spaces, particularly in the first and last name, as these will be used to create the login name. And assign each of the fields to a variable or possibly more than one variable. Next we will create the user account in Active Directory using the variables. And as part of the creation process we should create an output file which will contain the user account details, giving the username, login name and initial password details. With scripts of this nature, that are potentially complex, I sometimes break them up into one or more short scripts doing specific tasks, during the test and creation stage. In this case we have 3 main tasks. 1. Read and manipulate the data. 2. Create the new user account in AD. And 3. Write an output file with the new user account details. This helps because we may already have scripts that do something similar, which we can amend as required. Or if we don't have something ourselves, then it's highly likely that we can find something similar on the internet. In our case we already have a script that can create a new user account in AD as shown. So we can leave that task for the time being and concentrate on task 1, to read and manipulate the data. We also have a script that we have created earlier, that we can amend to read our CSV data file, by simply changing the file name that we want to read from, as shown. And if we run the script we get a message box showing the raw data from the CSV file. Now let's add in our 5 field variables and a variable we are going to use to store the comma position in the data. Next we will add in a variable used to store the temp in text string length and add the relevant code using the len function. Then add code to get the first position in our string of a comma and assign to the variable for the comma position. And to help during the creation phase I add in a VBScript.echo command for the comma position. Now when we run the code, the VBScript.echo command displays the character position for the first comma in our input string. In this case it is 4, as the first name field in the string is Jim. So we need to write code to get the characters from the left of the comma position, to assign to the first name variable. And here is the code I have added to do this. I am using the left function, to get the characters from the left of the temp in text string, with the number of characters returned being the first comma position -1. So in the first line of our data file this will assign the value Jim to our first name variable. Note that I have put the expression, comma position -1 within its own set of brackets. This is so that this expression is carried out first before the left function is evaluated, so that we have the number of characters we need to return. And when we run the script now, we can see that our latest VBScript.echo command displays the name, Jim, as expected. As we have now written code to extract the first name field data from our temp in text string, we no longer need that in our data. We only need the right-hand side of data from the first comma position. To do this I have used the write function, as shown. Note that the number of characters that I want to return from the original temp in text string is determined by the expression string length minus comma position, again within its own brackets. And running the script now, our latest VBScript.echo displays the data that is assigned to the temp in text variable at this stage in the code. To get the data for the last name field we use the same left function code that we used before, as shown. As we have now written code to extract the last name field data from our temp in text string, we no longer need that in our data. We only need the right-hand side of data from the new first comma position. To do this I will use the write function again. However, before that I need to get the new length of the temp in text string as it has changed. So I must write code to use the len function on the temp in text string, before the code for the write function, as shown. Now let's add in the code to get the office and telephone number fields from our data, which are a repeat of the code we have already created for the last name field, but with the office and tel number variables used instead. And if we do the len function and write function one last time on our temp in text variable, we are left with the data after our last comma position, i.e., the end of the raw data string, which corresponds to the department field, as shown. If you remember, one of the requirements of our code was to ensure that there were no spaces in the first and last name fields. We can do this by using the trim function, which removes spaces from the beginning and end of a string. So I'll add the code for that into our script, as shown. Now we have written code to get all of the data into the relevant fields. Let's just confirm that, by adding in some code to display the data in a message box with one field per line. And after commenting out the VBScript.echo lines that were used to help in the creation and debugging process, we see the expected results for each of the user account entries in our CSV file, displayed in our message box, with one field per line, and blank lines where there was no telephone number. I'm now going to add in code for our output file that will contain the user account login details for each of the users in our CSV file. First I'll add in the variables and constant for writing the output file. Next I'll add in the code for the new file system object, assign the output file name to the output file variable, and then the code to create the text stream object for the output file, before adding the code to write the field headings to the output file, which need to be before the beginning of the do-while loop. And while I remember, I will add the code to close the output file at the end of the current code, after the loop keyword, as shown. I'm now going to add in some variables that I am going to use to determine if it is okay to create a user account from the data provided, as well as use these variables in a series of if statements that I will add next. And here are the first couple of if statements added, just before our loop keyword. Before the first if statement I am assigning true to the createAd user variable. Then in the first if statement I am checking if the first name variable is empty or not. If the first name variable is empty then I am assigning false to the createAd user variable, as well as assigning the text, missing first name, to the first name status variable. However, if the first name variable isn't empty, then I am assigning the first name status variable to be the same as the first name variable. The second if statement does exactly the same thing but for the last name variable. The reason I have created these if statement blocks is to meet one of the main requirements of our script. Namely that we should not create the user's account if one or both of the first or last names are blank. But we also need to write to the output file when one of these fields is empty, so that we know why we haven't created a particular user account. I'm adding a couple of new variables, cname and login name, which are for the common name and login name entries for our user account. These will help to make the code more readable and more meaningful when writing the login name to the output file. I've commented out all of my message box and VBScript.echo commands, as I'm happy with how the code is working so far. Now I can add in an if statement block that I will use to create the AD user account where appropriate. So in this if statement I am checking if the create AD user variable is equal to false. If that is the case, then it is not okay to create the AD account for that user, so I only write the first and last name status to the output file. In the else part of the statement I know that it is okay to create the AD user account. Therefore I assign the appropriate values to the cname and login name variables to use in the account creation. I've also added in a statement to write the relevant information to the output file which will occur after the AD user account creation code, as well as the end if part of the if statement block. Before I add in the code to create the AD user account, I want to test my code, to ensure that the logic is correct, using some test data, as shown. Now let's test the code. So we have an expected end of statement error message, so let's look at line 77, where the error occurred. I missed out an ampersand, so I'll add it in and save the script. Now let's run the script again. This time it runs without an error and produces the output file. And if we look at the output file in Excel, we see that our code logic is correct. The missing first and last name entries have been recognized. And the rest of the data is as expected for user accounts that will be created when the AD code is added in. Now let's add in the code to create the AD user accounts. As you can see, this is basically our original standalone code that was created for the previous video, but with some amendments for a new login name variable, as well as if statements to ensure we only add entries to the office, telephone number and department if those fields contain data. Now let's run our code to create the AD user accounts. The process has completed without any errors. And after refreshing AD, we see that all of the new user accounts have been created as expected, with all the relevant fields added to the account as well as the login name defined by our code. We can also see that the accounts have been enabled, and that the user must change their password at the next login, both of which were part of our AD user account creation script. And if we look at our output file, this contains all the relevant login information for each of the newly created AD user accounts. And that in essence is the completed code, as all of our requirements have been met. The script reads in user details from a CSV data file and splits the data into the 5 designated fields. It accommodates any empty fields in the user information. It also removes any unwanted spaces within the first and last name fields, and assigns the data to the relevant variable or variables, before creating the AD user accounts as required, as well as creating an output file with the user login details included. However, although our requirements have been met and the script works as expected in my test environment, where there are a limited amount of user accounts, and I can manage those accounts so that they are all unique, and have different first and last names, in the real world it is likely that there will be people with the same name. So let's see what happens when I try to create a user with the same first and last name as an existing user, using the script. rather than try and add code into our working creation script to accommodate duplicate usernames, which might break it and be difficult to debug. I created a new script from scratch from the original create a single user account script, with the user details included in the script. This method allowed me to not worry about reading in the data and all of the other requirements of our working script for creating multiple users, and to just concentrate on how to handle duplicate users to create unique Active Directory accounts. I looked at different methods of checking for existing accounts, and finally came up with using dsquery, an Active Directory command line tool, used for querying various types of AD objects as the best solution for my needs. And here is the code I came up with. At the top of the code you can see a number of new variables. I've added display name and surname variables, along with some other variables which are used in the process to check if the user already exists, etc. The top of the code also has the new user details assigned to the variables, in this case it is Alan Jones, along with the relevant code for creation of a file system object and the for reading constant. After the variable declarations and the user detail variable assignments, I have a variable called UserExists which I'm assigning an initial value of true, as well as assigning the value of CNAME, the AD common name attribute, to a variable called checkCNAME. Next I have added code for a do until UserExists equals false loop. This is the start of the section of code that will check if a user account already exists or not. The first statement inside this loop is creating and assigning the dsquery command. This command is assigned to the variable called dsquery_cmd. The details of this command line is as follows. cmd/c opens a command window, which then runs the dsquery-name command, with the current user CNAME. It then redirects the result of this command, to a file called dsquery_result.txt. Here's the dsquery command run directly in a command window without the redirect to a file, using an existing user, and then with the redirect to the dsquery_result.txt file and how that file looks. And here's what a dsquery looks like for a user that doesn't already exist. Note this will still create a file in our code but it will be empty. Back to the code, and after the dsquery command assignment I am creating a VBScript shell object called obj_shell. Then I am using the object with the run method, to run the dsquery command, which will create the dsquery_result.txt file. The next line uses the VBScript sleep method to pause the script execution for 1000 milliseconds, which is 1 second. I've done this to allow the dsquery command to finish before continuing with the script. This is a sufficient pause for my Active Directory test environment, as there is no discernible lag in executing the dsquery command. However, in a real-world scenario, this pause in script execution might need to be increased, to ensure that the dsquery_result.txt file has been created before the rest of the code executes. Next I assign dsquery_result.txt file to the variable list_input file, and create a text stream object for this file, called list_in_stream. This is followed by a do-while loop, that reads in all of the contents of the file into a variable called temp_in_text, which in turn assigns the contents to a variable called result_val. And as you may already have noticed, I could have simply assigned the contents of the file directly to result_val. After the loop exits, I close the file and then delete it, to ensure that I am always working with the most recent file. Although this is a bit of overkill, and there shouldn't be a need to do this, experience has taught me that it's worth doing. You may also have noticed that I have created and assigned variables and objects in this script without first declaring them. Although this is not best practice, it is quite acceptable in VBScript and will generally not affect the execution of your scripts. If we look at the next section of code, I have added an if-else statement block. The if part of the if-else statement block is checking if the result_val variable is empty, which is the case if the user doesn't already exist. If this is the case, then the UserExists variable is set to false and the next line exits out of the do until loop. Note that I originally just had the UserExists variable set to false here, as this would have met the criteria to exit the do until loop, but added in the exit do statement to exit the loop sooner, rather than wait for the next iteration of the loop. So at present one of these lines is superfluous. The else part of the statement block is for when the result val variable is not empty, signifying that the CNAME already exists. Within the else block I first reset the result val variable to be empty. Then increment the x variable by 1. Note that prior to the first time into this statement x is empty or has a null value. I then assign the original CNAME variable value to the check CNAME variable, with the following line appending the value of x to the check CNAME variable. So for example, if the user Alan Jones already exists, then the else part of the statement block will be actioned, and the new check CNAME value will be Alan Jones 1. And in this case, as this would be a CNAME that doesn't already exist, the loop would exit. Once the code comes out of the loop, I assign the variable CNAME the original value of itself and the value of x. So in our example this would be Alan Jones 1. But for a user that doesn't already exist, it will just be the original CNAME value, as x would be empty. The next line simply adds the value of x to the last name variable value. And then the login name variable becomes the first name.last name as previously. So again, in our example the login name would be Alan.Jones1. And the final section of code in the script is for the creation of the new Active Directory user account. Now let's run the script. After the process has completed and we refresh AD, we see the new user account has been created for Alan Jones 1. And the login name and other details are set as expected. Creating a unique AD account as required. Now let's look at the check for existing user code added into the fully working user creation code. The new version of the code has some additional variables for the new code section, some of which have been amended to ensure they are unique. After the variables are declared, I have added some code to check if the dsquery executable is installed on the machine from where the script is run. This is done by using the FileExists method of a file system object, and if it doesn't exist on the machine, a message is displayed, as shown. And the script exits when the OK button is clicked. Note, RSAT stands for Remote Server Administration Tools. Now let's scroll down and see where I have added in the new code. As you can see, I have added it in just after the start of the else statement that determines that it is okay to create a user account. Assigning values to the new code variables, before the check user code itself. With the new code section finishing just before the actual AD user creation section of code. And if we look at the AD user creation code section, we can see that I have added in the relevant new variables of display name and surname, that weren't in the original code. Okay, let's try our new version of the creation script with some new test users. We have another Frank Williams to create, so this should be created as Frank Williams 1. We have a user called Graham Hill to create, a username that has not already been created, so that shouldn't change as it will already be unique. And finally we have another user called Alan Jones to create, who should be created as Alan Jones 3 this time. Okay, let's run the script for the new users. The script started okay but has stopped with an object required error, at line 121. So let's take a look at that line in the script. At first glance I couldn't see what the problem was in this case, as the error was for an object required, but I am creating the ds_in_stream text stream object on this line. However, after a bit of thought I realized that I hadn't created the fs3 file system object, which is required before I can create the text stream object. So let's add that in now. And if you're wondering, I added it at the top of the code just from personal preference, to have all of the file system objects created in the same section of code. Okay, let's try the updated code and see if it works okay this time. The script completed successfully, without any errors. Now let's look in Active Directory at the newly created accounts. Alan Jones has been created as Alan Jones 3, and Frank Williams as Frank Williams 1 as expected. But the Graham Hill user account has a 1 appended to it, which is not what we wanted as it is a user that didn't already exist. So it should actually have a login of graham.hill. So we have a bug in the script, and it's obvious that the problem is that the variable x is retaining its previous value. In this case it was a value of 1, from the Frank Williams user account creation. I can rectify that easily by assigning 0 to x outside of the do until user exists equals false loop, as shown. And this won't affect the value of the check CNAME variable, the first time into the loop, as it will be the same value as CNAME. However, if we scroll down the code to where the loop exits, we see that we are updating the variables by appending the value of x. So in the case where x equals 0, we would end up with a 0 appended to the login name, for a user that doesn't already exist, which is not what we want. To prevent this from happening, I will just amend the code here, with an if-else statement block, as shown. Now if the value of x is 0, then I assign the original values of the variables, CNAME, last name and login name, so that 0 does not get appended to them. Otherwise I append the value of x to the variables mentioned, which should fix this particular bug. I've deleted the latest test accounts from Active Directory, so I can run the amended script again with those usernames. So if the script runs correctly, we should have an Alan Jones 3 user, a Frank Williams 1 user, and a user called Graham Hill. Now let's run the script and see what happens. The script ran successfully, so let's look in Active Directory. And after refreshing AD, we can see that all of the new test accounts have been created as expected. So I'm happy that the script is complete now, as it not only meets all of the original requirements but can also handle duplicate usernames as well. The final script exceeds our original requirements, so the problem we set ourselves originally has been successfully solved. We could of course still make improvements to the script. For example, add in some code to generate a random password rather than have it hard-coded in the script as it currently is. We could also amend the code so that the dsquery command windows are hidden, rather than have them flashing up as they are now. However, I'm happy enough with the script as it is now, so we'll leave it as is. This was the final video in this series, which hopefully has been helpful to you. And as always, there is a link in the description box to the scripts created and used in this video.